Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy Dupuy. I have a PhD in learning disabilities. I also have a master's degree in secondary education with endorsements in science and special education. I do academic and learning assessments. I do a little bit of advocacy for families that work with me, and I do a little bit of intervention. And I've been doing this for over 20 years at this point, which is kind of hard. It's a big number, right? And I'm also an adult with both dyslexia and dysgraphia.
And my name is Kim Sharman. I met Cindy 20 years ago or more, and when I, for my own daughter's intervention and to analysis, and then I started practicing and learning the skills to remediate students with dyslexia and dysgraphia, and have my own practice for the last 15 years.
Okay, so today we're going to do something really interesting. And we're going to start with giving everybody an overview. So we're going to do an introduction, it's kind of a short video, which is this is part of. And then we're going to stop as one digestible chunk. And then we're going to go into part one of how do you begin to think about and organize your data. Part two is going to be what does the data tell you? And part three, which is the real meat on the bone, is what do you do about it? And so this is going to be a lot. So for parents to be able to, and clinicians to be able to digest this, we're going to take it in chunks so that you can watch one, think about what was said in there, and try and understand it, and then move on to each individual part. Otherwise, it is likely that you're going to be on information overload. So let's give a little context here. And a parent who had watched some of our videos reached out and said, hey, can you take a look at my kids' data? And I said, of course, we would love to look at your data and do a video on it and what we see and all of that kind of stuff. And what do we find, Kim?
We found lots of data, and some strange little information appeared by the discrepancies in data.
Okay, so she had data from a couple of different sources. So talk about what you think is really interesting about the different sources.
The different sources, as most of you will have, the first source is the data from the school. And then she had data from outside the school with private clinicians. She had multiple IQ tests on the student. And, one of the things is the fact that there was so much data that sometimes things get missed.
It's a lot to kind of navigate through. Now, you and I have talked about the fact that a clinical psychologist has a different perspective than a school psychologist. And we're not going to go deep down a rabbit hole, but a clinical psychologist is there to say, hey, there's something going on. Here's what I think is going on. A school psychologist, and pardon me if I'm oversimplifying this, and I know school psychologists do a ton of stuff. A school psychologist has a couple of tests, and that doesn't necessarily mean physical tests, but like litmus tests, if you will, or go, no go points that they have to work through in deciding whether or not your child will be eligible for special education services. So where an outside psychologist is really trying to understand what's happening with your students' learning or psychological profile and their needs, a school psychologist is trying to determine whether or not you can be made eligible for special education services.
And the level of detail is different.
And the level of the detail is different because an outside clinical psych potentially can get in and do more meat, where a clinical psychologist, or sorry, a school psychologist has a narrower band of what they'll do evaluation wise. So, and by the way, that can vary dramatically in outside clinical psychologists. So, and there are excellent school psychologists out there that dig deep and get as much data as they can. And there are clinical psychologists out there that just do the bare minimum as well and compile data. So it's not evaluating the goodness or badness, if you will, of either evaluator. It's what's the perspective as you're coming in, right? Does this child need special education services? And what should those special education services be? That makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about this parent. So we looked, I think she had 7, 8, 9 plus, like we didn't count all of the outside evals. She had evaluations completed by clinical psychologists, speech language pathologists, occupational therapists. Some of the evaluation was completed by somebody that's called a psychometrician. Do you know what a psychometrician is, Kim? You give me that Kim look.
Well, it means a person who does the physical testing, but doesn't necessarily analyze the data.
They don't interpret the testing data. So they are essentially, I don't want to call them a robot, but they're the person that's coming in and like there's some tests that you as a parent could administer. So for example, there's a test where there's 4 pictures, you say a word and you have to tell me which of the 4 pictures corresponds to that word. Once you understand, I mean, I could theoretically train somebody up how to do that test in about 30 minutes. And that would be an extended period of time. It's not a hard test to administer. The hard part is, why'd the score come out that way, right? What does the data tell us based on that? Okay. So she had a ton of data from a lot of different evaluators. And then she did this incredible thing, which was she threw it together in this giant spreadsheet that covered all of the tests that she had done by date, by area. We have blocked out all of that identifying information. And she's basically saying, I've got all this data. I know it means something. I don't know what it means.
She's not getting a lot of direction, it seems. So she's did the gathering, but the intervention piece and.
Well, she's got a sense of where she's got clinical, or she's got speech language pathologists are doing intervention with her kiddo, which is awesome. But I don't think she's got kind of that big overarching what's going on here and why. And we're going to try and get to that. So what I want to do very quickly before we jump into the meat of this, for anybody who's new looking at this, is we're going to do a little statistics lesson on what do the scores mean. Then we're going to stop and we're going to go into part 1. Okay. So Kim, what thing do I always tend to draw when I'm talking to parents about data?
A bell curve.
A bell curve. And I have an old one here that I need to clean off quickly, and I will draw it. So Kim, what are the kinds of scores that we look at? I know you hate it when I quiz you like this, when we're looking at test data. Do you remember?
Well, we want to see, we need to know what the average score is for the human population. And then we need to identify different chunks of data outside that normal range, whether it's above or below. Because this is, and so don't blank out, parents, because this is important to understand where your child is IQ wise and also with his academic performance, how that differences, the difference ranges between the two.
Okay, so we've got something called a standard score. And standard scores are either a compilation of a bunch of little tests to give you that bigger number or that more accurate number, or you're taking a test in which there's so many items, there's enough data there that they can get you to this more precise measurement. So I often tell parents that a standard score is kind of like thinking about measuring with a millimeter, where a scaled score is kind of like thinking about measuring in units of centimeters. The millimeter is way tighter or way more precise, and then a centimeter is less precise, but still a good measure. And both of those are equivalent and they both sit at the 50th percentile. So Kim, what does it mean to be sitting at the 50th percentile versus getting 50% right?
If you're in a room of 100 people, 50% of 50 of them will be above 100 and 50 will be below.
You are so good at this now. I love it.
But
Okay.
Cindy, we're not telling you them what the data are we talking about IQ or subtests or both?
So IQ tests, achievement tests, processing tests. I would say the majority of them work on standard scores or scale scores. There is, and those convert to various percentile ranks. There's one other score that you will see sometimes, which is a T-score, which has a very different metric. It's on a metric of 50. We're not going to worry too much about that. But the big thing that we're going to talk about, so that tells how a student sits in the population in general. What we're really interested in is what's the student's performance relative to themselves. So we are trying to go in and identify an individual student's strengths and weaknesses. Okay. So let's say a kid has an average IQ, okay, which is smack in at 100%. And I could have drawn my line a little better, but it's okay. So if a kid had a 100 IQ, there is a band of what we consider normal variation. I'm great at math. I don't like art. I want to study English literature. I will never be a professional writer. That's normal. Like if you went and talked to any student in any school, pardon me, a student would say, here's a subject I like, here's a subject I don't like, right? And that's harder for me. The big deal is when scores fall outside of that band, okay? And that band or that criteria varies by the theoretical perspective of the school district or the theoretical perspective of the clinician who's doing the evaluation. Okay.
So this is up for interpretation.
So
sometimes.
Yes. So I'm going to be perfectly clear with everybody. I work with regressed standard deviations, which is a technical term for any clinical psych out there or school psych out there that remembers their graduate level statistic classes. So I use scores based on, and again, parents, don't worry about this, regression to the mean. So I have calculated for various IQs what is considered to be a standard deviation gap between the student's IQ and their actual achievement. And you're going to see some of that in the data that we have. And there are different places where you can go and look up tables to get to that data. Okay. But that data is going to tell us where a student is having difficulty and why. So you are going to see some charts from me, and let me actually show you an example of this so that when we are talking about this data, you can understand what we're referencing. So when we look at this set of data for this particular student, here's that scale score, which is like measuring on a centimeter. Here's that standard score, which is like measuring to a millimeter. Here's the student's relative percentile rank, meaning on this particular task here, and we're going to talk about clumps of data here later, they would have beat 5 students their age from across the United States, and 94 would beat them. Okay. In contrast, on this particular task, this student would beat 75 students their age, and 24 would beat them. And then in this last column is that regressed or that standard deviation difference that we'll see, that band, right? So the bigger the number, the bigger the gap. So for example, here the student is in the 9th percentile, and that's a 1.75 standard deviation gap, where in this case, a student, you'll see a bunch of 2.3s, where they're scoring in the 1st percentile or below the 1st percentile. Once we get 2 1/3 standard deviations out, the gap is so big, we just stop measuring. Like, it just doesn't make sense. It's like putting zeros. It's so big and so unusual that it's like, why measure anymore? It's not meaningful if we measure bigger than that. Does that make sense?
Can I say one in a parent term?
Sure.
Compared this student, compared to what the IQ of the student is, this is so far away from his true capability that there needs to be some type of intervention. So when you see these 2.0 standard deviations, this is not right. This
Right.
is something that can be addressed. There's something very wrong here.
Right. And by the way, here's our lowest, which is a 1.35. Yeah, and so part of the way I organize my data, which we're going to talk about, is clustering, and that helps me identify what's getting in the way of the students' learning and how I understand what's happening for them. So we're gonna stop here and end this video, and we're gonna jump into part 1, and we're gonna see both the way I organize test data, the way the parent organized test data, and then a slightly different way, which is what I'm going to tell you as a parent to do, to begin to, or a clinician, to begin to think about how to look at data and what that data means. So come back, we've got lots more to learn.